If there is a committee out there, Interstellar committee, trying to decide whether there are intelligent civilizations around stars, they may have concluded so far that we are not intelligent enough.
On June 25th, 2021, the Pentagon released a report acknowledging the existence of objects in our sky that we cannot explain.
Unidentified aerial phenomena.
Case closed, right? UFOs exist. Not so fast. The US government has a long history of drumming up fake threats and staging false flag incidents to basically create the conditions for war and more defense funding.
Repeated acts of violence against the armed forces of the United States must be met.
So would the government have any reason to make us believe that aliens exist and that they mean us harm? Absolutely. The prospect of the plot of Independence Day playing out in real life is a pretty persuasive one. But unless this is the best government psyop of all time, I just don't see UFOs as a false flag. My main reasoning for this is that there are a critical number of sober, competent, and at least to my knowledge, not intelligence-associated fighter pilots who claim to see UFOs. Pilots like Commander David Fravor, who saw the famous Tic Tac in 2004 off the coast of San Diego.
We saw this little white Tic Tac looking object, and it's just kind of moving above the whitewater area.
These pilots could be lying, but if anything, the military has a selfless culture that frowns upon dishonesty and attention-seeking. A culture that would make any pilot hesitant to say that they had seen a UFO.
If I saw this solo, I don't know that I would have come back and said anything, because it sounds so crazy when I say it.
But if you read that June 25th Pentagon report closely, you'll see that there's a tension in it.
I could clearly detect a voice, an authorial voice that wanted to disclose more, and one that said over my dead body.
Either way, we're at the complete disposal of a semi-trustworthy, at best, government when it comes to UFO disclosure. They own all the data, all the footage, all the materials, and it's up to them as to whether they want to disclose that to the public, right? Wrong. Enter Harvard astronomer Dr. Avi Loeb.
Good to see you, Jesse. We are trying to basically build our own observatories that are designed for the purpose of figuring out the nature of those unusual objects that were identified by the military.
With his Galileo project, he's putting optical, radar, magnetic, infrared, and audio sensors on top of Harvard's observatory in order to gain more conclusive and publicly available data on UAPs. With billions of years and galaxies on his side, Avi thinks that it is the epitome of human hubris to claim that we are alone and at the center of the universe.
People believe that we are at the center of the world. That was a mistake. We are not privileged in any way. Most of the stars formed billions of years before the sun. Therefore, it's very likely that we have a neighbor.
A tough Israeli guy, Dr. Loeb seems to be immune to both the tractors and the cold.
Yeah, well, I jogged at 5 a.m. this morning and also yesterday during the snowstorm.
On his idyllic snowy front porch in Massachusetts, he managed completely fine in a suit, while I had to bundle up and borrow gloves and look like the Michelin Man for this entire interview. In this wide-ranging interview, we go deep on the Galileo Project and its aims. We discuss Oumuamua, the mysterious interstellar object in 2017 that opened Avi up to the possibility of extraterrestrial life. And we talk about how vitally important it is that serious scientists in academia begin to look into this fundamental question. Now, before we blast off into the ether, I do have to warn you that aliens don't take kindly to non-subscribers of American Alchemy. So hit that red button, flip on the notifications, sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with the ever-curious ambassador of scientific wonder, this week's American Alchemist, Dr. Avi Loeb.
Different parts of the brain have different activities.
But you know that, don't you?
Maybe you should interview me.
The way I see our future in space is by sending our technological kids in the form of equipment with artificial intelligence. And if we can imagine sending those AI systems that currently drive cars into space in the form of AI astronauts, then maybe other civilizations have done that already.
Feels like the government has a very curious relationship to UAPs.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
From 1947 to 1952, there seemed to be a general open-mindedness on the part of the US government when it came to exploring UFOs. The Air Force even established its own UFO investigation program called Operation Blue Book. Known crashes like those at Trinity and Roswell, and sightings like that of Kenneth Arnold, only served to make people in and around government more convinced that there might be something there. Then something pretty insane happened. There were an overwhelming series of sightings in Washington, D.C. in July of 1952. The event made headline national news and was dubbed the Invasion of Washington. This prompted a very concerned CIA to write a memo saying that the UFO phenomena was a matter of national security and could touch off mass hysteria and panic. A commission of academics was then formed by Caltech physicist Dr. H.P. Robertson. It suggested that the government should systematically downplay the phenomena through media, movies, and other means. Every leader of Project Blue Book from that point forward seemed at least publicly very skeptical of the extraterrestrial explanation for UFOs. The 1968 Condon Report closed shop on Blue Book and dismissed a lot of its findings with very prosaic explanations. That was until 2017 when a New York Times journalist named Leslie Kean revealed that the government had a UFO investigation program called ATIP that had formed in 2007 and was being run under the auspices of Bigelow Aerospace. I guess one sort of meta question I always ask is like, why now? Why is this sort of ramping up in popularity? And I find you very interesting because, you know, it's not like you're jumping on some trend. Really, it's the Oumuamua inquiry for you that kind of got you into this sort of study.
Which also happened in 2017, October, a couple of months before.
That's fascinating. Okay, well, that's really interesting. Yeah, so why is this so in the zeitgeist now?
Well, I don't know. You know, you can think of me just as a farm boy that is curious. And for me, the appearance of Oumuamua triggered the interest in this subject.
In 2017, the Pan-STARRS telescope in Hawaii discovered a fast-traveling object in space called Oumuamua.
It was given the name Oumuamua because it means in the Hawaiian language a scout, a messenger from far away.
Yeah. The interstellar object was about the size of a football field and didn't fit any of our known criteria for asteroids or comets. Most strikingly, it didn't have a cometary tail, a space rock's form of propulsion. It also changed speed erratically.
All the proposals that were put on the table to explain the anomalies of Oumuamua invoked a rock of a type that we've never seen before. I always think about a caveman. What would have happened if a caveman would find a cell phone? The caveman would argue that the cell phone must be a rock of a type that we've never seen before. And if the caveman is not curious, he would throw away the rock and that will be the end of it.
Well, that's a really interesting quip because it's like the Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology looks like magic. In some cases, any sufficiently advanced technology looks mundane.
Yes, yes.
Scientists made many guesses as to what it could be. A chunk of frozen nitrogen, a cloud of hydrogen, or a dust cloud. But all of these theories had holes in them. So Dr. Loeb had a new theory, that the object was a light sail, a thin structure that used the reflection of sunlight to propel itself forward. But there's only one problem with that.
Nature doesn't make such thin, solid objects.
Yeah. A length to width ratio of above 3 is almost never seen in an asteroid. So Avi speculated that maybe Oumuamua was intelligently designed, and he even wrote a fantastic book on it called Extraterrestrial. Needless to say, he received a lot of backlash from his peers, but Avi held his ground.
Many of my colleagues in academia still say it's extraordinary to even consider that there is another intelligent civilization out there.
Then came some very interesting possible vindication for Dr. Avi Loeb. In September of 2020, Pan-STARR found another object that was similarly baffling. Like Oumuamua, it was traveling away from the sun. It didn't have any cometary tail or visible propulsion. Turns out we now know that object was intelligently designed technological equipment. The only thing is, it was ours. A forgotten rocket booster from a 1966 NASA mission that, you guessed it, uses sunlight to propel itself. So if humans can build light sails, why can't extraterrestrials?
I can see a better future for science if some of the analysis would be done by AI systems, because AI systems will not be attached to their ego. You know, the AI system would say, well, it doesn't look like any rock we've seen before, therefore maybe It's a piece of equipment, just like we launched, but being produced by someone else. The question is, who produced it?
So this is a really interesting point, because I think the AI approach sort of seems to make sense for like the next Oumuamua, because if you can classify an asteroid as this is not a typical asteroid, and then we can actually send a rover out and sample it, that's an incredibly exciting prospect. With UAPs and UFOs, the thing that I worry about is if human inference can't figure out what's going on at low sample size. So right now, we have hundreds of cases, at least according to the government, and we really have no idea what the hell is going on. These crafts break conservation of momentum. They are transmedium. They just don't work at all, like normal sort of aircrafts that we know work. Why at high sample size would we understand what's going on, and why would a classifier, an AI system, be able to figure that out?
Okay, so it's not the sample size, it's the quality of the data. If you look at all the data that was released to the public, it's not convincing scientifically. I cannot write a scientific paper based on eyewitness testimonies. The way that science is done, physics is done, is using instruments that you have full control over. And if you think about military-grade equipment, it is designed to the battlefield. It's not the same quality instrumentation that you would use on a scientific expedition trying to figure out what these objects are. Now, it's possible that the government has high-quality data, but it's classified. The government uses a lot of sensors that are monitoring the sky above the United States. But you don't want the adversaries to know the quality of the instruments being used. That's why the Galileo Project aims to get open data and analyze it in a transparent way.
The Galileo Project has received funding in order to set up an array of detection devices on top of the Harvard College Observatory. It will be the first multisensory system of its kind, combining optical, infrared, radar, audio, and magnetic sensors. Artificial intelligence algorithms will be used to classify the objects as a bird, a drone, or something else.
I received thousands of emails from people that are excited to contribute to the project. By now we have more than 100 scientists engaged in the Galileo Project. We are purchasing the instrumentation that we will place on the roof of the Harvard College Observatory in the coming months.
And then the main update over government then is the constant passive observation. Because the government has all of those things, right? But
Anecdotal, yes. Every now and then they
anecdotal.
would see something, but they didn't really intend to see it. Another thing that I'm being asked a lot is, how come astronomers look at the sky all the time? How come they don't see these things? Well, the answer is simple. Astronomers are focusing on distant sources that don't move much on the sky. And as a result, if a bird flies above the observatory, they ignore it. 70 years ago, Enrico Fermi went to lunch with his colleagues, and they talked on the question of how likely it is that there are extraterrestrials out there. And he said, but where is everybody? And that to me is very presumptuous. It's just like sitting at home and saying, nobody is knocking on my door, therefore I don't have neighbors. Well, Enrico, you should look through your windows with telescopes in order to find your neighbors. You can't just say, where is everybody? It's just like someone sitting on the beach and saying, where is all the fish? Of course, if you don't use a fishing net, you will not find any. And if you use a fishing net, you better make the fishing net with holes that are sufficiently small, smaller than the size of a fish.
You have a predecessor at Harvard, a guy named John Mack, who was head of the psychiatry department, who looked into kind of alien abduction stuff on a more of an anecdotal kind of personal level. He interviewed a bunch of abductees. And then, Dr. Gary Nolan, of course, at Stanford as well. All of these guys seem to think that there's some element involved in the person seeing the alien or the craft. And there's, that breaks our materialist reductionist paradigm. We should live in a Cartesian dualist universe. There should be objective matter. My mind should be completely separate from that. And yet, they're saying that certain people can see these things and other people can't. What do you think?
Well, you cannot use, in particular, people as detectors of reality. I mean, of course, there is a whole field of social science, psychology, trying to understand people. That's perfectly fine if your subject is people. But if your subject is objects flying in the sky, then I wouldn't give a damn about what people testify, because I want to detect those things with instruments.
But if we find out that a disproportionate amount of fighter pilots who see UFOs have an enlarged caudate nucleus and putamen.
So it's an area that I've talked about before between the head of the caudate and the putamen, and it was larger in all these individuals.
That seems worthy of investigation.
Well,
right?
the question is, what is the cause and effect in that case? Because it may well be that because they have these things in their brain, they are hallucinating.
But fighter pilots, I mean, they need to be objective about reality in every other sense.
Yeah. So I would say
life and death.
It's not as if I don't believe them or I doubt that they had these experiences. It's just that I want to validate it. And the way to do that is by publishing in mainstream journals scientific data that was collected by instrumentation that we have full control over.
It feels like this is ramped up since the 1940s, and maybe even in conjunction with our development of nuclear weapons. And people who've claimed interactions seem to say that, you know, the aliens are trying to tell them that we're destroying ourselves and that there's some sort of hubris involved in mankind, and we're killing ourselves with both tech and moral depravity or whatever.
Well, my concern is that we are going in a direction where virtual realities appeal to people more than the actual reality we all share.
Especially, like, you see that there are now UFOs, at least in the fact that they're unidentified, in reality. And you want to go into the metaverse? Like, let's figure this out first. It's way more exciting.
Exactly.
And that's a good segue into an essay that you wrote that I really enjoyed, which is that VR might be a good answer, actually, to the Fermi paradox. Do you want to talk about that?
So as soon as I heard about the metaverse being announced,
yes,
I realized that it may be a solution to Enrico Fermi's paradox. If there are lots of advanced technological civilizations that live in their virtual realities, they may close themselves in a cocoon.
Yeah.
And you might ask, will we ever know about them? Well, the answer is possibly, because they still have to satisfy the second law of thermodynamics. They produce some trash that they deposit into space. Mm-hmm. And just like those reporters that go through the trash cans of celebrities in Hollywood to figure out their private lives, we might find some trash in space and know that they exist.
Well, we're creating a lot of trash in space. We're putting up all these satellites for the internet service provider, LEO constellation networks.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's interesting to see how much the launch market is ramped up and how much it will ramp up probably over the next 15, 20, 25 years.
That's the whole point of doing archaeology in space, that you can find all those plastic bottles that were released into the ocean of interstellar space over the billions of years.
Do you think that alien civilizations sending probes or envoys or drones would be more likely than them maybe coming themselves?
Definitely. I do think that the equipment is much more likely to be our first encounter rather than living creatures, because they cannot survive space exposed to cosmic rays. And by the way, that's one of my criticism about space tourism, where people talk about establishing large communities of people on the surface of Mars.
It feels like that rests on so many assumptions. Yeah, it's like the magnetic field of the Earth protects us from cosmic radiation, and then you have, we need to nuke the poles to terraform Mars, and you need to nuke them, 4,000 times a day.
Drop thermonuclear weapons over the poles.
There are a lot of, I love Elon.
Right, but there is no need to, because we can be proud of our technological kids.
Human Homo sapiens have been physiologically the same for about 200,000 years. And then all of a sudden, in the last 5% of our existence, 10,000 years ago, we get the agricultural revolution. And just about every founding myth talks about people from the stars, teaching us agriculture. You have all sorts of megalithic architecture that, feels very hard for even people in the modern day with modern engineering to build. You have cargo cults in French Polynesia building landing tracks for presumably some alien craft to return that's rooted in their mythology. You have a lot of anecdotal kind of weird evidence around that time. You have Sumerian architecture that shows a precocious knowledge of astronomy. It shows a heliocentric universe, which, as you said, Galileo was put on house arrest and considered a heretic for, thousands of years later. So I think all of those things are pretty interesting, and maybe it has something to do with the roots of our civilization.
We definitely could learn something new about our history by finding our neighbors or welcoming guests. One reason for that is that you can benefit from guests, get some knowledge about things that go beyond what you experienced. Definitely a good reason for us to welcome interstellar guests, because we can learn about our past, we can learn about places we've never visited.
Do you have a sense of the nearest kind of habitable exoplanet? Do you have a best candidate? Is it Kepler 452 or is it Proxima Centauri? Or?
Well, Proxima Centauri happens to have a planet which is called Proxima b. The point about this planet is it has a permanent day side, a permanent night side. So one conclusion from that is if there is a civilization on that planet and they are technologically advanced, they would put photovoltaic cells on the day side and generate electricity that will illuminate the night side. So a few months ago, I wrote a paper with an undergraduate student from Stanford, basically saying that the James Webb Space Telescope could look for city lights on the night side of Proxima b, this planet in the habitable zone around Proxima Centauri. If we see the dark side being illuminated, we know that it's artificial.
What do you say to there are plenty of physicists who talk about the anthropic principle. They say that, something like Planck's constant is just so improbable.
And it turns out that everywhere we look, there's a lot of little accidents, seeming accidents that had to happen that allow us to be here.
What do you think?
Well, regarding the constants in physics, we don't know where they came from, and whether they have other values elsewhere is something to look for. Again, we should be modest. That would be an excellent question to ask an extraterrestrial. Perhaps they figured it out. My concern is that if there is a committee out there, interstellar committee trying to decide whether there are intelligent civilizations around stars in the Milky Way galaxy, they may have concluded so far that we are not intelligent enough. Because by the way we treat each other, by the way we behave, not worrying about our environment and being careless about various things. But in fact, the most embarrassing thing was New Horizons, which was sent to explore Pluto. And NASA decided to put 30 grams of ashes of the person who discovered Pluto, Clyde Tombaugh, the scientist. And to me, that's very embarrassing, because if you think about it, what are ashes? Ashes are burnt up DNA. So we take the genetic information of a person and we burn it up.
You destroy it.
There is no information content. You put it in a box on a spacecraft to commemorate the person who discovered Pluto. If another civilization sees that, it would be very embarrassing, because they would say, what is this primitive ritual that this culture is going through? They destroy the information about a person that they want to commemorate.
My colleague Eric Weinstein recently joined the Galileo Project. We sometimes speculate about the physics of UAPs. He's obviously much higher level than me. He thinks they might exhibit geometric unity-like properties. I have another friend who thinks that maybe they're sort of more macroscopic quantum properties.
To me, immediately I realized that's not your average macroscopic interaction. It's actually probably because it's an emergent property of underlying strange quantum mechanics that are going on.
Do you have any sense of what the physics are of UAPs?
Well, I think, again, we should be modest in the sense of, just like this caveman seeing a cell phone, we should not pretend to figure out what it might represent if we have not really studied it.
Final question for you. Do you think we'll find metamaterials that exhibit properties when it comes to aerospace capabilities that we just don't presently have? So things like anti-gravity.
Well, I should say that the universe is accelerating its expansion. So there is anti-gravity pushing galaxies away from each other. Einstein liked the idea that the universe never expanded, because then you don't have to imagine what was there before the beginning. So he introduced a negative gravity from the vacuum, such that it would balance exactly the effect of matter. But that was his biggest blunder, his biggest mistake, in the sense that we know the universe is expanding. He didn't know it. And after it was realized the universe is expanding, Einstein said, okay, it's a mistake, forget about it. Then it turned out the universe is accelerating its expansion actually recently. So altogether, you have negative gravity. Now the question is, can you harvest that negative gravity in a technological way?
On a local level, yeah.
Yeah, and that is something we don't know, but we definitely know that it's possible to produce anti-gravity because we see the universe accelerating its expansion. That's a fact. To me, it's obvious, it's a matter of common sense that if the public cares so much about this subject, and if the government is puzzled about this subject, that scientists should help, especially given the implications if we end up finding that these objects are extraterrestrial equipment. You know, that would be huge. And there you can use the argument raised by Blaise Pascal, who said, we don't know if God exists, but the implications, if God exists, the implications are huge. Therefore, we should not dismiss it, that notion, up front.
My favorite Blaise Pascal quote might be, the limit of rationality is the end point of rationality, is the end of rationality. But I find it very noble that you are a rational man looking at something that seems very irrational.
When I was 18, I was drafted to the military, and the first training I had was in the paratroopers. At the time, I remember the saying that sometimes a soldier needs to put his body on the barbed wire so that other soldiers will pass through. And that's pretty much what I feel. I feel that this subject is so important that I don't care how many wounds I get out of the interaction with some of my conservative colleagues, because it's important for humanity in the long run.
Yes.
Let's not be the adults in the room. Let's be the kids that explore the world and figure it out.
Let's do it. I think it's very cool what you're doing, man. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.